Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters from around the world. And my name's Owen Bennett-Jones. I'm sitting in for Nicholas Wood today, and we're talking about Morocco in this session. Complicated place. The monarchy still very much in control, but at the same time, there are political parties that contest elections, and then there are these territorial challenges, the struggle for the control of Western Sahara that's been going on for so long, and the two Spanish enclaves just on the Mediterranean coast, which produce all kinds of issues in this age of refugee movement. And to help us understand it all, we've got Richard Hamilton. Now, he's author and former BBC correspondent there. He is leading a tour there in February, as presumably some of you know, because I presume some of you are on it. And Richard, welcome. How are you?
Fine, thank you, Owen. Thanks very much for having me.
Not at all. And very pleased for you to come. And just to help us really with the monarchy, first of all, I think Mohammed VI, since 1999. What is the role of the monarchy? How strong is the king? How does it work?
Yeah, they're basically three red lines for Moroccans, thankfully not so much for international journalists, but there are three things that you can't criticize. One is religion. Another is Western Sahara, and third, and they're all sort of equally important, is the monarchy. You can't question the monarchy. And the Alawite dynasty, it's nothing to do with the Alawites in Syria. It's a Moroccan dynasty. It goes back to the 17th century, and King Hassan II was the king before Mohammed VI. And he was threatened. Well, there were actually two military coups against him in the 1970s. And that made him a bit paranoid, as you might expect, and he became more autocratic. And it was also during the Cold War. So he was backed by the USA, and Algeria was backed by the Soviet Union. So King Hassan became more ruthless, and he imprisoned some of his generals and people that he thought had staged these coups against him. There's sort of interesting stories about King Hassan. The first coup he survived because he was in his palace. He hid in the toilet. The second coup was on a plane. The plane was being shot down by some officers from the army, and King Hassan grabbed controls of the aircraft and said, "It's the pilot speaking. You've killed the king. It's time to call off the mission." And that was actually King Hassan. So he survived, but he was good stories, but he was very ruthless. And the people that were even vaguely accused of being part of these coups got arrested and imprisoned and put in underground cells. And this only emerged after the death of King Hassan. A Moroccan author, wrote a book called The Blinding Absence of Light, based on true stories of people that had been almost buried alive beneath the ground, and they'd been in isolation in these tiny cells under the ground for decades, and they came out. And so when King Mohammed VI came to the throne in 1999, he wanted to put all that behind him, and he got off on a very good footing, and he changed the constitution later, but he also brought in reforms bringing greater rights for women. They were allowed to divorce.
Okay. So we'll talk about those reforms.
Yeah, sure. So basically, King Mohammed VI is generally popular. It's always difficult to say how popular is someone when there's not much criticism allowed, but he's considered a reformer and a moderate, certainly compared to his father.
Now, it's interesting you talk about those military coups, because a lot of countries that are in the same region have been ruled by the military, and normally quite badly governed. I mean, look at the terrible state of Egypt as the prime example of, a very ill-led country. Now, the monarchies have tended to be more stable, haven't they? And I guess Morocco is an example of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And if you look at the monarchy in Jordan, and maybe it's more controversial, but the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, and certainly the monarchy in Morocco, it tends to give stability and continuity, and it's the sort of glue that holds society together. And Moroccans hate Algerians. As I say, this goes back to the Cold War, and they look across the border at the sort of terrible bloodshed that was caused in the 90s, and the military regime, le pouvoir, it's called in Algeria. And Moroccans think, well, thank God we're not like that. We have a king that is essentially kind and moderate and has got our best interests at heart. Admittedly, he's worth, recent estimates say $8 billion. So, that's a bit of a contrast. But on the whole, people respect the monarchy in Morocco, and it's been a source of stability. And, it's gone on for 300 years, and it's unlikely to fall anytime soon.
I mean, that prompts a thought. You're saying worth $8 billion. One of the striking things I think about the Gulf is the way those monarchies have shared their oil wealth with their people, which is so different to, I don't know, Nigeria and many other countries that have got significant oil resources, and it's ended up with a kleptocratic elite at the top. How does Morocco fit in on that scale of, spreading out the largesse?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I was just checking sort of before we did this. Transparency International rates Morocco, or last year, on their perception of corruption index as 99th out of 180 countries. So not Denmark and Finland, but not Nigeria either. So there is some corruption, and there's certainly an elite that it surrounds the palace, and they do most of the day-to-day decisions. And I think King Mohammed, although, as I say, he's a moderate, there's some reports that he's a bit of a reluctant monarch, and he'd rather spend time jet skiing and going to the south of France and hanging around with his friends. And he's sort of quite a shy man who doesn't like to be in the public spotlight. And so there is this elite that surrounds him, and they're his advisors. It's called the Maxen, and it's just it goes back to a word for the courtiers in the palace. So, unless that's the thing about Morocco, unless you know people that are well connected, it's quite hard to get ahead. But it is democracy. There is a parliament, there's an upper house, a lower house. They make the day-to-day decisions, but the ultimate power still lies with the king. So I'm not really sure it's widely shared, like you're saying. I don't know about Gulf countries, but there's no oil in Morocco, but there are phosphates and agricultural wealth and tourism, and it's difficult to. There is a gap between rich and poor, certainly.
I should qualify what I said about the Gulf, and it's shared with Emirati citizens, but not with the millions who work there, and often very ill paid. But when you talk about the parliament, how does that work then? You've got these royal advisors, and you've got, let's say, members of parliament who've been elected, right? How would, if you wanted to be powerful, would you be better off being a royal advisor or a senior member of parliament?
And they're not mutually exclusive. You can be quite close to the king and a member of parliament. Cynics have said that the parliament is window dressing and it's a fig leaf of democracy, and in fact, it's a very powerful monarchy behind that. But I think that's probably a bit strong. I think parliament. I think Morocco's become more democratic over the decades. I think that there's more. One of the things after the Arab Spring, again, King Mohammed VI had his nose to the ground or whatever, and he sensed the pulse of what people were feeling, and he introduced reforms. And one of those was that it was no longer just the king that chose the prime minister, and it was no longer just the king that sort of chose the strongest party in parliament. So it has evolved democratically. And King Mohammed VI was quite clever because he saw what was happening in Tunisia and Algeria and Egypt, and he wanted to hang on. So he made sure that there were reforms and that there was more democracy. But it was sort of little by little. In Arabic, they say shwiya shwiya. So he cleverly managed, he let the pressure valve off this boiling kettle. So he slowly allowed democracy in. So you definitely, when it comes to like budgets and tourism numbers and healthcare and the sort of day-to-day running of the country, the parliament is totally legitimate. But if there's something major like Western Sahara, or whether I don't know whether Britain recognizes Western Sahara or whether a deal is done with the Spanish over immigration and these enclaves you mentioned. If there's something sort of massive, it has to come from the top,
Mhm.
even if it's via these advisors. But in terms of the day-to-day bureaucracy and the nuts and bolts and nitty-gritty of running the country, that's Parliament, and it's totally legitimate. And people do vote, and the largest party gets in. So, the elections are democratic.
Okay, let's just say, and could we have the people who've asked questions I can see in the Q&A box, if they could be promoted to video contributions, that'd be good. And while we're just waiting for that to happen, just to say, if you want to get involved, please do. You can raise your hand, you can put a question in that Q&A box, and you can participate that way. Elaine, you've got two questions. Why don't we take them separately? And your first question about France. Tell us what you want to know.
Yes, good evening, Richard. And thank you for your contribution. It's some years since I was last in Morocco. So I'm wondering what the current relationship is between Morocco and France, and are there any other wider issues, perhaps some of them you might just have mentioned, that France is raising with Morocco?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, Elaine. I mean, as you probably know, in a lot of West African countries, France is getting a bit of a kicking, and these military coups have thrown out the French army and have cut all the diplomatic ties. So it's been a very abrupt farewell to Macron and France. Morocco is a bit more nuanced in the sense that there's no big rupture, but Morocco is gradually, like, for example, English is now more widely taught in schools, and Arabic is still the first language. But again, King Mohammed VI has introduced Berber or Amazigh, which is the indigenous sort of language. So, and French has sort of slowly gone down the pecking order. But because of that long-standing colonial relationship, I mean, it wasn't a colony, they called it a protectorate, but to all intents and purposes, it was a colony. And when I speak to a lot of ordinary Moroccans, because I go there quite a lot, I've just come back from a trip to Tangier, a lot of young people don't really like the French. They like the English, they like the Americans, but they're a bit, they find that the attitudes, particularly amongst the older generation, they can remember French people being a bit, blasé and a bit rude and a bit sort of entitled, because the French obviously, ruled as the colonizers and, had a nice life. And then a lot of Moroccans, the elder generation, still remember that. And they just feel that there's a slightly superior attitude amongst the French towards ordinary Moroccans. But on a sort of wider geopolitical scale, France and Morocco are close and they have good relationships. And Morocco is endlessly lobbying for European countries to recognize Western Sahara. And I think, I can't remember if France has gone over that, trod that line. I'd have to check that, but certainly making overtures towards recognizing Western Sahara. So France, I think France is aware that it's losing a lot of its allies in Africa. So they want to keep the Moroccan relationship strong, and I think it is still strong.
We will go through the Western Sahara issue. Yeah. It's complicated and it's important. Yeah. It needs explaining clearly. Yeah. We'll do that in a bit. But just, Elaine, you had another question.
Yes, completely unrelated, but I'm doing a course at the university in my hometown here in Cardiff, and I was surprised to find a young Moroccan woman in my class. And we are communicating in French as it happens, because my Arabic is very limited. But I wondered, what are the circumstances which might lead a young Moroccan person to seek refugee status in Great Britain?
I mean, is she a refugee or?
Yes, she is.
Oh, right. Okay. Uh, there could be, I mean, I could just make lots of speculation. If young Moroccans protest against Western Sahara, they can get put in prison.
Mm.
If young Moroccans, espouse views or say anything against the monarchy or go on protests, there's a lot of human rights protests. I don't know, Owen, if we want to go into the recent wave of protests or if we want to do that as a separate question.
Hey, that's a good time to do it because
Okay.
who knows
Okay.
why she's a refugee and if she's got asylum or if she's the
Yeah. I mean, I don't know about her case, but, I'm just surmising why some people might feel, that under threat. And so there was recently a whole movement, a Gen Z movement in Morocco of people protesting against this inequality. And they were particularly unhappy about the amount of money that Morocco's investing and spending in the World Cup that's coming up in 2030. They're supposed to have spent or will spend about $5 billion. And the young generation, a lot of people went out onto the streets and protested, saying, okay, we've got the stadiums, but where are the hospitals? Where are the schools? So there has been this gulf between, the wealth at the top and the amount of money that Morocco wants to put into the World Cup to showcase what a modern country it is. And the reality on the ground for millions of young people who can't get jobs, and if they do protest, the police might come and beat them up, and 3 people have been shot and about 400 or 500 people were arrested. So it's not all the tourist image of Morocco is the souks and the spices and the carpet and the lovely stuff. But the reality is there's a lot of poverty, a lot of illiteracy, healthcare is poor, there's quite a lot of corruption, and people that protest might get in trouble. And certainly if anyone protests against human rights abuses in Western Sahara, that they're not going to be at liberty for very long. So I don't know this woman's backstory, but there are ways that you'd become persona non grata. They just literally, sorry, yesterday the Moroccan government announced that it would spend $15 billion on healthcare and education. So that was in response to these recent protests. So you have to sort of again give the monarchy and the government some credit for reacting quite quickly rather than digging their heels in, which some of the military regimes tend to do. If people protest in Egypt, then the tear gas come out and it's a lot more brutal.
Elaine, thank you. It is interesting to reflect that these youthful protests in Nepal have created a significant difference in Nepal. I mean, they worked. And there's similar things going on elsewhere. Morocco is probably another leading example of these so-called Gen Z protests. Now, Alan has a question which I'm going to ask in a minute, because I think you've mentioned his microphone's gone, so I will do it for him. But just as we're waiting for that, you've mentioned Western Sahara a number of times, and we should say, in '76, the Moroccans annexed Western Sahara, which was with the Spanish right before then, and then this group that I used to report on the whole time when presenting programs in London, the Polisario Front, became, a big, big deal for many, many years. And now there's a ceasefire. It's been in place for a long time. But with the issue basically unresolved as to who controls Western Sahara, can you just give us the very basics on the dispute and who controls what now?
Yeah. So it ties in with quite nicely with what I was saying about King Hassan. So in the early 70s, he had these coups. He justifiably felt quite insecure about his position. So when Spain decolonized what was Spanish Sahara, Spain just left in a hurry because in the 70s, lots of people wanted to be independent and the UN said, you've got to decolonize. So Spain just left in a hurry. So there was this vacuum. So King Hassan, under threat and all these coups, it was a bit of a genius move. He organized something called the Green March in 1975, and 350,000 Moroccans walked into Western Sahara waving Moroccan flags, and they have a national day called the Green March Day. I think it's the 6th of November every year. And I've talked to these veterans. They weren't military people, they were ordinary people. They marched into Western Sahara, and the following year, 1976, Morocco annexed it. And Morocco's ever since then claimed that it belongs to them. There are some historical links. There are sort of rebel warlords and chiefs that pledged allegiance to the Sultan at the time of sort of in 1700 or whatever. And Morocco has done its best to present that case to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice and all the rest of it to say, look, we have a legitimate historical right to this country, certainly more than Spain ever did. And, you know, Morocco says it's ours. But as Owen says, the Polisario, which is backed by Algeria, they represent the indigenous Sahrawi, it's a bit difficult to pronounce, Sahrawi people. And a lot of them, thousands of them, have to live in camps over the other side of the border in Algeria, and they're not allowed to go back to their homeland. So it's been a political hot potato for decades. There was a war in the early 90s. The UN said the best thing is to have a referendum. Morocco never really agreed to that, and since then they've been trying to sort of populate Western Sahara with Moroccans so that if they ever had a referendum, the vote would be in favor of going for Morocco. And now, and in recent years, Morocco have said, okay, we'll give Western Sahara some autonomy, but it still has to be part of Morocco. And that plan has been accepted by Britain. David Lammy, about a month ago, in a rather surprise move, said Britain recognises Morocco's plans for Western Sahara. And I think that's a bit of post-Brexit realpolitik, because Britain needs as many allies commercially as possible. And Britain wanted to do deals with Morocco. They wanted to have its green energy and cables going underwater, and you know, they want to do business with Morocco. And Morocco's managed to lobby other countries like Spain and France, and a lot of them are coming round to this idea that, you know, for decades this dispute's not been resolved. So the sort of least worst option is that it belongs to Morocco, but it has some autonomy. So there's some sense in that, because if you just handed it over to the Polisario, it wouldn't. I'm not sure the world needs another small nation. If you look at South Sudan, I'm not sure the map needs to be fragmented into more small parts. So the Morocco's got an argument for it, but the United Nations still says it's not part of Morocco and it should be decided by the people of Western Sahara. So that's where we are now. Oh, and sorry, Donald Trump, very importantly, recognizes Western Sahara as Moroccan because it's part of his Abraham Accords, whereby Morocco and other Arab countries recognize Israel. So that sort of pushed, I think that pushed Keir Starmer, who wants to be Trump's best mate, into maybe as well recognizing that Morocco's plans for Western Sahara make sense. So it's complicated, but we're getting there.
Just to be clear on that bit of it, the Americans and the Israelis recognized the Moroccan claim to Western Sahara in Trump's first term, right?
Yeah.
And then there was Moroccan recognition or normalization of relationships with
Israel. Yeah, that's right.
That set the pattern that's...
So I think that's the most significant thing. And then the sort of other players like Britain have sort of followed suit because they want to keep in with Trump.
Right. Okay, so more questions, please. Do raise your hand or make a comment in the chat box. Meanwhile, I will ask Alan's question, which is what arrangements are in place for the succession to the present king?
Well, that's a good point. He has a couple of children, and but they're still quite young, so there might have to be a sort of regent or something. I don't know the exact age of his children. I think they may be teenagers. I don't think they could, you know, if he died suddenly, I'm not sure they could suddenly. I'd have to look at this sort of historical precedents for that. I mean, like in sort of the 17th century or whatever, you know, you'd have a regent and you'd have a courtier holding fort until the young prince takes over. But King Mohammed is relatively young, so I don't think we need to worry about. I mean, there have been reports of poor health and things like that. And as I say, in some ways he's a bit of a shy man, a bit reluctant to be king, but he knows his duty, and so it would go to, his eldest son, or I mean, he's no longer with his wife. She's sort of been sidelined. They're not together anymore. She sort of lives in the south of France. But I don't know the actual ins and outs of what arrangements are in place. But it's a long way off because he's only like 65 or something.
Now, you mentioned the World Cup, and that will be a big deal. I mean, for all these protests, I presume that's a sure thing, and obviously there'll be massive investments involved in that. And whether or not World Cups are economically beneficial is a sort of controversial issue on which there are studies each 4 years as it's assessed. Tell us about that. Because it's unusual, isn't it? It's a multinational one.
That's right. So it's going to be co-hosted by Spain, Portugal, and Morocco in 2030. It's all a done deal. There's no more vetting or whatever. That it's been approved. Morocco, as people that are interested in sport will probably know, are actually a fantastically good football team. They did very well in the last World Cup, and I think they nearly beat France in the semi-final or something. Anyway, Moroccans are passionate about football. If you go to the north of Morocco, they're all watching Real Madrid against Barcelona. You can walk down the street. I walked down the street in Tangier recently, and someone said to me, what team do you support? And he was able to reel off the names of players for Liverpool in the 1980s and 90s, which is extraordinary. So they're passionate about football, and they see it as a great opportunity to welcome people to their country. It's not a question of sports washing in the sense that Qatar or Saudi Arabia want to get the World Cup to legitimize their regime. Morocco, as I say, is a pretty moderate country, so they're not doing this to cover up terrible human rights problems, but they are spending an enormous amount of money on these stadiums. They're going to build the biggest football stadium in the world outside Casablanca. It's going to cost $500 million. And this is what really annoyed young people. They just thought, if you've got $500 million to throw against the wall for a new stadium, why don't you spend more on healthcare or education? But having said that, Morocco loves football. People are very affectionate towards Morocco. They were almost everybody's second team because they were the underdogs, So you support England, but then if Morocco did well against France or whatever, everybody loved Morocco. And, I think it will be a great boost for the country. They modernized. When I was there recently, they've repainted a lot of these cities, they've rebuilt them, they've done an awful lot of investment. There's a slightly dark side to that in the sense that they bulldozed some shanty towns, they bulldozed an old fishing village where surfers used to hang out because it didn't suit this sort of they wanted to have new motorways, they've got a super fast train now. The modernities, they're pushing forward, and they didn't like the look of these shanty towns or these disgusting villages where hairy surfers would hang out. And they also started clearing up all the stray dogs in Morocco. So a lot of dogs have been put to death. And then you occasionally see a dog with an ear tag, which means it belongs to a family and it's sort of like registered. But someone said to me recently, where have all the dogs gone? And they've basically been killed. And there's more cats than dogs now. And again, it's part of cleaning up Morocco. And I worry slightly that it's sort of sanitizing and it's sort of repainting the country, whereas a lot of tourists love the old, slightly shabby look of places like Marrakesh and Tangier and Fez. And you go there now and everything's gleaming and it's starting to look a bit like Dubai. So I think Morocco is the World Cup is a transformative moment for Morocco, and it's got to tread that fine line between being ultra modern and keeping its identity and its character. And I always quite liked its slightly shabby, shady, dodgy side, the sort of Marrakesh Express, that Jimi Hendrix, Paul Bowles, William Burroughs. I like all that history of Morocco, and I worry that it'll become too modern and too clean.
Although maybe the young people would prefer that. Maybe that's Orientalism. in action.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've got my biases.
So when you, I'd like Pieter to be brought into the conversation, just as we're waiting for him. Oh no, here he is. Pieter, you got a question? You're muted.
Yes, I
Yes.
would like to ask about the remittances. In my experience, the Moroccan diplomacy has put in a lot of effort to keep close contacts with the Moroccan diaspora, in, for instance, in the Netherlands and Belgium. And I think that these remittances will diminish quite a lot when a new generation take over. How does it work out economically at the moment in Morocco?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch
How important are remittances? Are they going to diminish? And do the Moroccans really keep in touch with their diaspora closely in an attempt to keep those remittances going?
Right. It's a big question, but when I was living there, I don't know if this has changed, but I was working as the BBC correspondent quite a long time ago, 2006 and 2007. And in the summer, you would have, I think they call them MRE or whatever, and it was Moroccans Residents Étrangers. So it's Moroccans living abroad, and they'd come and see their families in the summer. And they really enjoyed reconnecting with their families. But a lot of ordinary people thought, who are these flashy people that have turned up, flaunting their wealth and hiring a Mercedes to drive along the Corniche and slightly show off? So there's a slightly ambiguous relationship between the people that have gone abroad and made a success for, of themselves, and people not stuck in Morocco, but people that are not able, because it's very hard to get a visa or get European citizenship, and if you don't want to get a boat across the Mediterranean or jump over a fence into Ceuta, it's very hard to leave Morocco. So then these flashy people come back from Amsterdam or London or Paris or whatever with their flaunting their success, and a lot of Moroccans think, I don't really like your attitude. But that's just a sort of anecdotal thing. I'm not saying everyone feels that. And I think there's a big diaspora, and Moroccans, there are societies I know in London that are promoting those sort of relationships, and they invest in literary festivals, and so that they try to keep those relationships close. But I don't know about actual figures. It's in terms of what the remittances are worth. It's not like Somalia, where remittances are keeping the country going. I think it's just a sort of bonus, really.
You mentioned people jumping over the fence into one of those Spanish enclaves, which is an interesting thought. And it is remarkable that there are bits of Spain within Morocco, right? And I don't know, could you tell how big are they? How important are they? What happens if people do climb over the fence? Are they in Spain? Can they apply for asylum in Spain? How does it work?
Yeah, you're right. They're the only European territories in Africa, and they're the oldest colonies in Africa. So they go back to like the 15th century, when Spain and Portugal took over these little enclaves because they wanted trading posts along the coast of the along the northern coast of North Africa, so the southern coast of the Mediterranean. They, like Tangier or Gibraltar, they were strategically important for seafaring nations like the Portuguese and the Spanish to have a hold on an edge of Africa. And they're sort of geographical and historical anomalies because they're tiny and there are not many people living there, like 20,000 or 30,000 people or whatever. But technically, if you can scale these wire fences, which are something like 5 meters high, sort of what happens is you get sort of 300 people storming the fence, and only 10% or whatever get over the fence. But technically, they can claim that they've landed in Europe and that they should be treated as an asylum seeker. So in some ways, that might be better, in odds-wise, than jumping onto a rubber dinghy and trying to go across the Strait of Gibraltar, where you might drown, because it's a lot more dangerous than going across from the currents and the waves and the oceans. It's a lot more dangerous crossing than going from Dover to Calais, or vice versa.
Right, so that's explained some of the politics of that. Now, we've got about 10 minutes left. I think I've got lots of questions actually, but before that, I think we should just get on to the tour because you're going in February. I think the tour is full, but there's always a good reason to get onto the wait list if you're interested. A, because people do sometimes drop out, often through health issues or something like that, or family circumstances. So it's good to be on the wait list. And more than that, there'll be probably more tours. So it's getting ahead of that queue, if you like. Where are you going to go? Who are you going to meet?
Yeah, so thanks, Owen. So I'm just looking at my notes now because I don't know this all by heart. But we fly into Marrakesh on the 7th of February. We spend some time there, then we go into the Atlas Mountains. I've arranged for us to meet an English academic called Ella Williams who lives in Morocco, and she did a PhD at Oxford on the Berber people. Berber's a bit of an old expression. They prefer to be called Amazigh. So she's an expert on the Amazigh culture of the Atlas Mountains, and she will introduce us. She will talk to us about the culture of the Berber people. It's always been slightly different. They were sort of very defiant. They were defiant against the French. They were defiant against the Arab conquest in the 7th century. So the Berber people, or the Amazigh people, go way back before the Arabs arrived. And they have a strong sense of identity, but they've been slightly marginalized. And people may remember there was this devastating earthquake in 2023 in Marrakesh, and well, the epicenter was in the Atlas Mountains, and a lot of the Berber people felt they were marginalized and that the government just cared about making sure that the mosques in Marrakesh looked nice and that the tourists would come back. But they did nothing or very little for the poor people in these Atlas Mountain villages. And some of them are still living in tents and still don't have homes because thousands of people died and thousands of buildings were destroyed. And it was a very big area, a very remote part of Morocco. But it's an interesting time to go to the Atlas Mountains, and the people are incredibly hospitable. And Ella will tell us about them. Then after that, the plan was to go on to Casablanca, which is nothing like the Hollywood movie. It's the industrial hub of Morocco. It's the sort of throbbing heart, and we'll try and meet because we haven't arranged every single person now, so I can't name everyone, but we'll try and meet, captains of industry or filmmakers or journalists, because Casablanca is sort of where it's happening. Marrakesh is the pretty touristy place. Rabat is the capital in terms of the parliament and the politicians and the NGOs, but Casablanca is the commercial and industrial heartland of Morocco. So to really understand Morocco, you've got to go to Casablanca. There is a recreation of Rick's Bar from the movie, and we're going to try and go there because it's actually really nicely done, and it was founded by a former American diplomat, and it's beautifully done. The food's fantastic, and they show the movie on a continuous loop on the walls. And the waiters look like they do in the movie, but it's not remotely naff or tacky or cheesy. It's a really fantastic experience. So we'll try and do that. Then we'll go on to Rabat, which, as I say, is the parliamentary capital. And then there's an option of an extra day in Fez, which is sort of the cultural capital. It's the oldest city. It's the most beautifully preserved medieval city in the world. And it's not so much important politically, but culturally and historically and architecturally, it's the most fantastic place. So I would really recommend a day trip or a day and a night in Fez before we fly out of Rabat again. And the interesting thing about Fez is some of the oldest families and the most powerful families in Morocco all come from Fez. And their surname will be Al Fassi, which means from Fez, or the Fez person. And anyone who's an Al Fassi is sort of not to be messed with. They're high up in government. They've got fingers in lots of pies. So that's an important dynamic, is this sort of regional, the strength of Fez goes back hundreds of years because it's founded like in the 8th century, and it's sort of Morocco's heart, cultural heart, if not its political. Because Rabat's a more modern capital, and the capital changed in the 300 years ago, whatever dynasties set up they'd say, oh, our capital is Marrakesh, or it's Fez, or it's Meknes. So the capital has shifted. But I think Fez is, if you get a chance to go for a day and explore the Medina in Fez, you're in for a treat. It's not as touristy as Marrakesh.
Thank you for that little guide. And just to say the obvious point that on these tours, you're dealing with politicians and officials and people who are extremely busy and powerful, and they don't, you can't set them up in October for February. So
no, but we would definitely be able to meet politicians in Rabat and go to the parliament, and that's, definitely
great.
Can do that. I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but it's just we haven't got names and dates and time. And in Morocco, that's the thing. It's not always, things don't always, it's not like Switzerland. Things don't always go to plan. They have a saying in Morocco that nothing is certain, but everything is possible. So I had to remind myself about that as a journalist, because frequently I would set up an interview and then the guy wasn't there, or they'd say, how about next week? Or they'd say, I'm not ready for the interview. Can we just have a chat? Do you want a cup of tea? So it was a bit frustrating, but at the same time, there's always something unusual, always something different happens in Morocco, that the unexpected. So I'm not saying it's chaotic. I'm just saying it's delightfully unpredictable. And again, King Hassan II, there was a Reuters correspondent based in Rabat who was there for like 20, 30 years. And King Hassan said to him, the more you know about Morocco, the less you understand. And the Reuters correspondent said, yeah, that sums it up. So I'm still sort of ultimately a bit confused by Morocco. I think I know it pretty well, but it still baffles me. But I think that's part of its appeal.
Excellent. And first of all, if anyone wants to get a question in, now's the time, because we've got about 5 minutes left. And I just was reading that there were quite significant reforms on women's rights. And when I was having never been to Morocco, but in Tunisia, I was very struck by the prominence of women in society there and how strong the women were, how big jobs they were. Very much part of politics and society, what's going on, and in a way that's not true of many, North African countries. What's the situation in Morocco with women's rights and their role in society?
Yeah, as you say, when King Mohammed came to power in 1999, he introduced reform, and it was focusing on like the divorce laws. Women could divorce their husbands, and that did help. And there certainly are women members of parliament, but they've still got quite a long way to go. So I think it may not be quite the picture that you painted in Tunisia. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I've interviewed female politicians and female advisors in the government, and a lot of women are getting more prominent roles in society. But it's still quite a patriarchy, and there's still a long way to go. But certainly amongst the sort of younger generation, you see a lot of female activists, and they're very switched on and well educated and passionate and dynamic. And I sense that even when I come back, a few years after my last trip, I sense there's a young generation of Moroccans who are, they speak English, they're savvy, they've got their laptops, they're creating galleries and art spaces and designs. And I get the feeling that the youth and young women are getting more involved, and they're not just staying at home and looking after children, which was the case sort of 20, 30 years ago. So I think it's changing, but they're not up to sort of parity yet.
I'm sure one issue you'll deal with on the tour is the role of Islam and the extent of violent jihadism in as much as it exists in Morocco. So I'm going to leave that for those people who go on the tour, and you can talk through that at the time.
Because that could take me an hour to deal with that.
Yeah, and we've just last question is from Peter. I'm going to read it. How about climate change in Morocco?
Yeah, so it is quite worrying. Morocco's had droughts in recent years, and they become more common and more severe, and there's water shortages. And then again, the sort of rich people play golf in Marrakesh, and those golf courses suck a lot of water up and stuff. So Morocco's at the forefront of seeing the real impact of climate change. But again, to their credit, they are investing in solar energy. So they've got one of the world's biggest fields of solar panels in the Sahara. And, you know, they're quite serious about this sort of green transition, which a lot of countries pay lip service to. But I think Morocco is genuinely, you know, they've got solar power, they've got wind turbines, so they are committed to you know, making that transition. But they are at the same time seeing the effects for real, and you know, water shortages, and again, this has fueled this anger and protests amongst the Gen Z. That, you know, if you're rich and you can have a nice round of golf on a lush palm-lined golf course, that's fine. But if you live in some poor village where there's very little water, you know, it's only going to get worse for them. So you've had this migration from rural areas to the big cities, and that's happened across Africa. And so Casablanca and Rabat and stuff and Tangier are getting bigger, and the sort of agricultural side is suffering because it's hard for people to make money. And then and there was also a lot of cannabis grown in the north of Morocco, which was very lucrative, but under pressure from like the United States and Europe, Morocco's tried to clamp down on growing hashish in the mountains, but that was very lucrative. So it's quite hard to be a farmer in Morocco now.
Look, you've got a huge amount of knowledge about this, and I'm very jealous of those going on the tour, because you're clearly going to be explaining an awful lot of very interesting things. So thank you for this little taster of what you're doing in February. And that's goodbye from Richard Hamilton, with thanks to him, and goodbye from me, Owen Bennett-Jones, here in London.